Let's talk about that side of the story with Fox News contributors Benson and Concha. Gentlemen, great to have you with us. Joe, I'll start with you on this media angle. Listen, this is one of the biggest stories to break, and I'm reminded tonight that Time Magazine broke some of Roe v. Wade and what was going to happen with that case before it came out, but I can't remember something of this magnitude in the 15 years I've covered the court. What do you make of the media moving ahead with something like this tonight?
Well, drafts like this, Shannon, are leaked to set off a 7-alarm fire to Democrats, liberals, that this could happen and to start mobilizing now. It's virtually guaranteed as a result of, and this will blot out the sun as far as media coverage over the foreseeable future, quite frankly. And you will see massive protests, marches in cities across the country as early as this weekend. And wait till you see the headlines and the op-eds tomorrow. Hyperbole does not even begin to describe what we're in store for already tonight. You can see it online. And look, SCOTUS blog, and echoing Jonathan Turley, and it's largely an independent news source for the Supreme Court. I'm sure you follow it, Shannon, right? Says this of the leak. Quote, "It's impossible to overstate the earthquake that this will cause inside the court in terms of the destruction of trust among the justices and staff. This leak is the gravest, most unforgivable sin." Unquote. So, look, just 10 years ago, the Supreme Court had a 61% approval rating, just 28% disapproving. Recently, Gallup has the Supreme Court now at only 40% approval, 53% approval, with many respondents saying it's become too politicized, too weaponized. We're talking about a 44-point swing in the span of a decade. And this week may be permanently damaging to the reputation of an institution that used to be held in the highest regard of all government institutions, as you know, Shannon.
Yeah, and Guy, listen, I've always been very impressed by the fact that this place is locked down pretty darn tight. And the chief has made very clear that he cares deeply, and I think all the justices do, about the institutional protection and nature of the court, that it not be viewed as something that can be torn apart by politics. Guy, this has got to be the biggest headache for him tonight.
Well, it's a huge test when it comes to the integrity of the court. This, if it was detonated by a clerk, let's say, of one of the dissenting justices, that is the presiding and prevailing theory right now, this is an attempt to sort of set off the judicial equivalent of a grenade at the Supreme Court to try to perhaps move some of these justices who would get, wind of public opinion and maybe change their mind, or just to try to prolong the anger and the tantrum if they feel like that they've lost this case and there's no way that they're going to prevail ultimately, that they're just going to break this tradition in order to try to delegitimize the court moving forward. That would be a punitive strategy because they didn't get their way in this, of course, very important case. And I think that the likelihood of any of the justices being moved by this off of their position, if this in fact is authentic, the content of this leak, I think it's virtually none. I think all the justices would have to, in fact, dig in for the court's reputation. They can't be cowed by this sort of thing. And I wonder, because we saw the report from Politico's that it's 5-3 right now. Unclear what Chief Justice Roberts would do. He's very concerned about the public's view of the court. I wonder if he might view this as an attack on the court itself, and if that might affect his thinking as to how he rules in this case.
Yeah, and I think back about this term. I was just thinking, gosh, over the last few months, it really hasn't been that long. We had Maskgate, when there was an allegation that Justice Gorsuch was refusing to wear a mask and that, it was concerning to Justice Sotomayor. She had to sit next to him on the bench, and I had reporting on that right away, striking it down. Then we end up getting the statements from multiple justices, Justice Sotomayor, Justice Gorsuch, then the chief himself putting out a statement that that stuff was not true. Then we had the leaked retirement news of Justice Breyer. I mean, Joe, this has been a wild term for the Supreme Court. They don't usually make those kinds of headlines, and now we've had several in a very short period of time.
That's a great point. Just in the past couple of months alone, we saw more leaks than we've seen out of the Supreme Court probably in its existence, right? And now you see the result immediately. As you mentioned before, Capital City Police having to put barricades around the Supreme Court. When Politico went public with this, and there were people already there, as you said, it's peaceful, but it's loud, and I can only imagine what it's going to look like tomorrow. But to Guy's point, I think that this really does change the whole complexion of the November midterm midterms, which were looking like they were heading towards a red tsunami in the House and the Senate flipping back to the GOP. They only needed to net one seat. And now, for the first time in a long time, Democrats are energized, but so too are Republicans. It's going to get very, very interesting, very, very heated, Shannon, no question.
So the ACLU out with this comment tonight on this leaked SCOTUS opinion. If it turns out to be true, they say the breach in protocol at the court pales in comparison to the breach in constitutional freedoms that the court is charged with upholding. And Guy, if this draft opinion turns out to be legit, and if it holds as the bulk of the opinion, ultimately the official opinion that we get, the whole argument there that Justice Alito allegedly writes about is that there was never a constitutional right to abortion. It was created, he says.
Right. It was conjured up by 7 justices in the early 70s, and has been controversial and not really settled law ever since. There were massive protests, and there's, tens of thousands of people who show up every January to this day, every single year, to protest what they view, many of us view, as a grave injustice back in the 70s. And so this has been a hot button. It has been a flashpoint. There have been cases along the way, including Casey in 1992, sort of altering the jurisprudence here a little bit. This would be clearly an earthquake, not necessarily one that is not expected, right? Based on the oral argument, it seemed like at least this Mississippi law was going to be upheld, and the justices might go further. And it appears, based on this Politico report, that they've decided to just do away with this fundamentally, I think, unfair and unsupported Supreme Court precedent that obviously will be extremely controversial, very polarizing. And yes, it might affect the elections in November. It's also early May, and we do not have much of an attention span in this country, and there's a lot else happening in this country and around the world.
That is true, Joe. When you think about it, when we're still months out from the midterms, there will be many other scandals and headlines between now and then. How do you think this rates ultimately in the midterms?
A few more leaks coming, but this is the biggest one, obviously. I can't see anything eclipsing this, but, you can't be surprised anymore. I'll leave it with this. I looked at Gallup again as far as polling in terms of the very simple question, are you pro-life or are you pro-choice? And right now, that's basically even split. 49% pro-choice, 47% pro-life. And if you look at the chart, it almost doesn't move over the years. So I think the media will portray this as, oh, well, everybody's pro-choice now, so this is not going to fly. The country is right down the middle, basically, on this, Shannon. I think that's something that when you watch the reporting, watch to see how often that's mentioned, because it won't be, quite frankly.
Yeah, and also important to remind people, if this ends up being what is at the heart of the ultimate opinion, it simply sends this decision back to Roe, and it doesn't mean there are no abortions in the United States. It doesn't mean that at all, right. And we need to make sure and clarify that if this is what it ends up to be, people understand that. It will depend in great deal where you live and who your legislators are that you elect. All right, Guy and Joe, thank you both very much. We appreciate your time.
Thank you, Shannon.
Thanks, Shannon.